On the night of June 1, 2026, the Russian military launched 729 airborne weapons into Ukrainian airspace. 65,000 tons of metal, electronics, and volatile fuel crossed the border in under 6 hours. In Kyiv, this hardware reduced a commercial car dealership to a heap of melted glass and twisted steel frames. In Dnipro, a single missile struck a 9-story concrete block, compressing the living spaces of dozens of families into a single mound of smoking rubble. By morning, rescue teams confirmed 22 deaths. The international press documented the smoke over the capital and the bodies in Dnipro. Yet, the true trajectory of the war shifted hundreds of miles away, deep inside 5 Russian regions where civil aviation ground to a halt. While the residential quarters of Ukraine burned, the Federal Aviation Agency of Russia suspended all flights in Volgograd, Kaluga, Saratov, Krasnodar, and Penza. This vast territory closed to commercial traffic because a parallel fleet of aircraft was moving in the opposite direction. Corporate boardrooms and military procurement offices decided the arithmetic of this night years ago. The Russian Air Force deployed 656 low-cost loitering munitions alongside 73 high-precision ballistic and cruise missiles. The Ukrainian Air Force utilized mobile machine gun units, electronic jamming, and Western batteries to destroy 602 of those drones. This outcome appears to be a defensive victory on a television screen, but the underlying industrial arithmetic reveals a systemic crisis. A single Iranian-designed Shahed drone costs the Russian state $20,000 to manufacture. The advanced Western interceptor required to destroy a fast-moving ballistic missile traveling on a steep terminal trajectory costs $4 million per shot. When a defender spends $100 to neutralize a single dollar of offensive capital, military success ceases to matter. The offensive strategy relies entirely on this economic disproportion. The Kremlin designs these massive raids to exhaust a finite inventory of physical objects. Manufacturing plants in the United States create this inventory bottleneck. The Patriot missile defense system relies on PAC-3 interceptors produced by RTX and Lockheed Martin. These contractors operate on rigid schedules dictated by multi-year lead times for specialized rocket motors and guidance microchips. The expansion of hostilities in the Middle East heavily depleted the existing stockpiles of the United States military. A factory floor in Arkansas cannot duplicate its machinery output overnight to compensate for a dual theater drawdown. Physical limitations govern the ceiling of Ukrainian survival. This material scarcity forced a rare clinical admission in Kyiv. President Volodymyr Zelensky issued a public statement that omitted the standard language of wartime defiance. He stated that the volume of incoming ballistic strikes completely exceeds the physical capacity of available Western interceptors. A head of state admitted to his population that the government cannot protect its urban centers from destruction. This was not a political speech designed to rally morale. It was an audit of an empty warehouse. But the warehouse was not empty on the other side of the border. While Ukrainian cities absorbed the impact of the 729 weapons, the Ukrainian Deep Strike program executed its largest coordinated operation of the year. Independent open-source tracking indicates that at least 148 long-range strike drones crossed into Russian territory during the same darkness. These assets did not target military barracks. They targeted the physical machinery that provides the financial liquidity required to sustain the entire Russian state, the oil refining infrastructure. Drones struck the Ilsky refinery in the Krasnodar region, igniting a distillation column that processes thousands of metric tons of crude oil daily. This strike represented the 150th documented attack on Russian energy infrastructure since the full-scale invasion began. In the first 5 months of 2026 alone, Ukrainian operators launched 32 separate operations against refining assets. This frequency matches the entire operational output of the previous calendar year before the arrival of summer. The physical damage caused by these detonations accumulates inside the Russian economy like a slow industrial poison. Estimates indicate that these operations have degraded roughly 17% of Russia's total domestic refining capacity. This reduction equates to more than 1 million barrels of oil processing capacity removed from the daily market. At a single facility in Tuapse, the structural deformation requires a complete reconstruction project valued at $5 billion. The Kremlin can replace cheap drones, but it cannot source specialized petrochemical cracking towers without Western components. Here, the narrative enters a profound systemic contradiction. The destruction of 1 million barrels of refining capacity should logically starve the Russian treasury of capital. Instead, the global commodity market reacted to the disruption by constricting supply expectations. This anxiety, compounded by parallel tensions in the Persian Gulf, drove the global price of crude oil upward. In March, Russian oil export revenue jumped to approximately $19 billion, up from less than $10 billion in the preceding month. By striking the supply, Ukraine triggered a price correction that increased the financial liquidity of its adversary. This economic feedback loop directly impacts the domestic economy of the United States. Every successful detonation inside a Russian refinery acts as a small upward force on the price of consumer gasoline in North America. The Western consumer indirectly finances the defense of Ukraine while paying an involuntary energy tax at the fuel pump that simultaneously pads the budget of the Kremlin. The global interconnectedness of energy markets ensures that destruction in one hemisphere creates profit in another. The war has shed its traditional military characteristics and transformed into a contest of raw industrial endurance and market manipulation. As the sun rose on June 3rd, the smoke over the Dnipro apartment block began to dissipate. But the structural foundations of the global defense and energy systems remained permanently warped. The machinery of both nations has accelerated past the point of human strategic control, entering a phase where the spreadsheets themselves dictate the survival of states. The system has begun to crack under the pressure of its own internal paradoxes, and the true breakdown is now gathering velocity just beyond the horizon. The 17% collapse of Russian oil refining capacity does not manifest as a clean, uniform reduction in national wealth. It functions as a localized mechanical starvation. The removal of 1 million barrels of daily processing concentrated the damage entirely on high-octane gasoline and primary diesel distillates. To prevent immediate paralysis in agricultural and military supply lines, the Kremlin enforced a total prohibition on fuel exports. This defensive maneuver instantly severed the state from the specific hard currency revenue streams that sustain its domestic banking liquidity. The crisis immediately transferred its weight to the state rail network. Because Western refineries could no longer process crude oil, millions of tons of unrefined extraction had to move eastward towards Siberian facilities. The Russian railway system converted into a jammed bottleneck of thousands of stagnant tank cars. This sudden cargo diversion collided with an invisible material deficit. The heavy freight locomotives moving these trains rely on high-grade synthetic lubricants and specialized tapered roller bearings previously imported from European manufacturers, deprived of Western industrial components. The State Railway Authority initiated a protocol of mechanical cannibalization. Engineers stripped active locomotives to provide spare parts for failing units. For every train successfully dispatched to the east, 2 stationary units entered permanent storage. By May 2026, the velocity of industrial freight across the Eurasian landmass slowed by 40%. The attempt to reroute the primary economic driver of the state had instead degraded the physical infrastructure required to transport it. This systemic friction escalated rapidly at the tactical military boundary. In the rear logistics zones of the occupied territories, the loss of fuel tankers and supply trucks reached 300 units per week. The Russian military responded by applying high-contrast geometric patterns to its logistics fleet. Soldiers covered Kamaz and Ural transport vehicles in bold black and white zebra stripes and swirling leaf designs, extending the paint over the chassis, cabins, and rubber tires. This visual modification was not designed to conceal the vehicles from human eyes. The paint targeted an artificial intelligence algorithm. Ukrainian strike drones utilize automated machine vision systems that scan terrestrial topography, identify the structural outlines of military hardware, and execute autonomous terminal guidance without human intervention. The geometric dazzle camouflage attempted to distort the edges of the vehicle, dropping the digital confidence threshold of the onboard computer below the level required to commit to a strike. The state sought a low-cost analog defense against an autonomous digital threat, The technical correction triggered an immediate counter-reaction. While the zebra stripes occasionally confused standard optical software, they offered zero protection against thermal imaging suites. The massive friction of a loaded truck engine generates a heat signature that stands out against cold terrain, regardless of surface coloration. Furthermore, the Ukrainian software developers retrained the neural networks within 72 hours, feeding the specific Russian camouflage patterns directly into the automated target identification datasets. The low-tech solution accelerated the failure rate of the logistics system. The high-contrast black and white patterns turned the trucks into highly visible targets for human drone operators operating in manual override mode during dawn and twilight. A vehicle altered to survive an algorithmic scan became a beacon for a human controller with a joystick. The loss rate of tactical supply trucks rose by 15% in the specific sectors where the camouflage was deployed. The attempt to shield the supply lines had systematically simplified the target acquisition process for the enemy. This continuous destruction of material equipment generated an immediate human capital crisis. To replace the thousands of drivers, mechanics, and refinery repair engineers lost to the conflict, the state expanded its recruitment incentives. The minimum signing bonus for a contract soldier rose to $22,000, an amount equivalent to several years of average industrial wages. This aggressive financial siphon emptied the factories and maintenance depots of their essential technical labor force. The Russian domestic market entered an artificial full employment trap. With unemployment dropping below 3%, civilian manufacturing sectors found themselves unable to compete with state-sponsored military wages. A severe labor deficit emerged inside the very factories tasked with reproducing the lost logistics infrastructure. To retain staff, civilian enterprises inflated wages across all sectors, detonating a massive wage price inflationary spiral that eroded the domestic purchasing power of the population. The Central Bank of Russia responded by utilizing its final macroeconomic mechanism. To suppress the exploding inflation rate, the governing board raised the benchmark interest rate to an unprecedented 25%. This drastic monetary tightening instantly froze the commercial credit market. Small and medium industrial enterprises found the cost of borrowing capital to be entirely prohibitive. The high interest rate did not stop state military spending, but it systematically strangled the secondary supply chains that provide components, packaging, and logistics support to the primary defense sector. The internal structure of the economy had warped into a shape where every self-preservation mechanism amplified the underlying pathology. To fix the refinery deficit, the state broke the rail system. To fix the logistics deficit, the military introduced a camouflage that increased vehicle losses. To fix the labor deficit, the Treasury generated an inflationary wave that forced the central bank to choke off domestic corporate credit. The entire system had transformed into a closed loop of compounding vulnerabilities, where every industrial action generated a greater economic reaction. The point of systemic equilibrium has dissolved. The structural contradictions have penetrated past the financial spreadsheets and into the physical reality of the machine. The industrial base can no longer reproduce its basic assets at the velocity they are being consumed. The gears of the state continue to turn, but they are grinding against their own unlubricated components, generating immense heat and metal shavings with every revolution. The tipping point has passed from a mathematical probability into a tangible mechanical countdown. The systemic friction observed in the opening months of 2026 has solidified into a permanent structural reality. The war has ceased to function as a conventional military engagement defined by territorial maneuvers. It now operates as a high-velocity liquidation machine where the primary inputs are industrial manufacturing capacity, supply chain bottlenecks, and raw macroeconomic endurance. The individual events on the battlefield represent mere superficial symptoms of a deeper ledger crisis that dictates the survival margins of both states. The contemporary calculation of air defense reveals an absolute material deficit that no immediate injection of capital can resolve. According to defense industrial data from June 2026, Russian manufacturing facilities now produce approximately 70 ballistic missiles every 30 days, combining 60 Iskander-M systems with 10 Kinzhal hypersonic variants. In stark contrast, Lockheed Martin delivered a total of 620 PAC-3 missile segment enhancement interceptors across the entirety of the previous calendar year, maintaining a monthly output of roughly 56 units. Euromaidan Press Standard military engagement doctrine multiplies the structural severity of this industrial imbalance. Intercepting a single incoming ballistic threat traveling on a terminal path requires a defensive salvo of 2 to 3 PAC-3 interceptors to ensure destruction. Consequently, a defender requires a minimum of 140 advanced interceptors each month, simply to neutralize a single month of Russian offensive production. The consumption rate of Western defensive capital outpaces its physical assembly velocity by a factor of 3, systematically draining the strategic reserves of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Euromaidan Pressure 1. To mitigate this terminal inventory depletion, Ukraine has scaled its domestic drone industry to unprecedented volumes, assembling up to 1,000 interceptor drones each day by early 2026. In the Kyiv operational sector, these cheap autonomous platforms successfully executed 70% of Shahed drone interceptions during the winter months. This domestic industrial mobilization successfully preserves low-tier air defense assets, but it possesses zero physical capability against ballistic trajectories. The technical boundary remains rigid. Electronic props cannot intercept a hypersonic weapon descending from the stratosphere. Just Security, the institutional attempt to rectify the primary interceptor shortage, materialized via a $4.7 billion framework contract signed between the United States Department of Defense and Lockheed Martin in April 2026. This procurement initiative outlines a strategy to more than triple annual PAC-3 output to 2,000 units. However, the industrial timeline exposes a delayed mechanism that fails the current crisis. The target velocity of 2,000 missiles will not achieve operational status until 2030. The defense of European airspace relies on a manufacturing capacity that exists only as a future projection on a corporate balance sheet. Industrial SAG, show 1 physical manufacturing dependencies prevent any mechanical compression of this 4-year delay. Each advanced PAC-3 interceptor requires a highly specialized active radar seeker produced exclusively by a single subcontractor, Boeing. Current industrial projections limit Boeing's seeker output to 3,000 units by 2030, a volume that must satisfy the concurrent procurement demands of multiple sovereign nations across Asia and Europe. Emergency legislative appropriations cannot materialize specialized cleanroom facilities or trained precision technicians overnight. Defense Express Show 1. The same industrial inertia governs the erosion of the Russian energy sector. Although the Kremlin collected 917 billion rubles in raw oil production taxes during April 2026, the state cannot convert these funds into instant physical repair. The Ministry of Finance diverted a significant portion of this capital directly into immediate refinery reconstruction funds and domestic price caps to suppress civilian fuel shortages. The actual net energy revenue entering the national treasury remained stagnant at $11 billion, barely exceeding the baseline required to maintain civil administration. RBC Ukraine. The visible evidence of this industrial decay has concentrated at the primary Russian maritime export hubs. The Baltic oil ports of Ust-Luga and Primorsk currently operate far below their historical handling baselines because regional refining damage prevents the standard conversion of crude into export-grade distillates. The state can no longer hide its systemic friction behind high global crude prices. The material destruction of petrochemical fractioning towers has restricted the physical volume of commodities that the state can move across international borders. Geopolitical market architecture has simultaneously bypassed the diplomatic maneuvers designed to isolate this revenue machine. In February 2026, the United States executed a bilateral trade framework with India, reducing tariffs on Indian exports in exchange for a commitment from New Delhi to decrease its intake of Russian crude oil. By April 2026, this diplomatic arrangement collapsed under the weight of market arbitrage. Indian imports of Russian crude rebounded to 2.15 million barrels per day as the extreme discount forced by Western sanctions made the commodity irresistible to commercial refiners. India narrative, show 1. The global consumer ultimately subsidizes this structural gridlock through the invisible plumbing of the international trade network. The ongoing destruction of refining assets across Eastern Europe continually constricts global fuel supply expectations, maintaining an upward pressure on the price of consumer gasoline in North America. The Western citizen indirectly funds the procurement of $4 million interceptors to protect Ukrainian urban infrastructure, while simultaneously paying an unlegislated energy tax at the domestic fuel pump that expands the gross liquidity of the Russian state. This system has entered a phase of absolute irreversibility. The structural transformations forced upon global defense manufacturing and energy distribution networks cannot be disassembled by a conventional diplomatic treaty or a localized armistice. The war has permanently altered the cost baseline of state security, demonstrating that cheap distributed autonomous weapons can systematically exhaust the concentrated industrial capital of the world's largest economic coalitions. The spreadsheets have outpaced the strategic choices of generals, and the remaining material runway has run out.